My name is Christina Kovacs, and this is The Chaos Inside. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you Lori for coming and joining us to talk about the topic of mental health and the way that we had seen it, witnessed it being handled within the Indiana Women's Prison. So Lori is a PLUS graduate, and she served as a suicide companion for approximately 4 years, and was actually the chair of Suicide Companion for quite some time, correct?
Yeah, probably a year and a half. It was supposed to be annual, but during my last speech to when I was forced to run, my speech was please write down anybody else's name, and somehow I still got voted in.
Well, that's actually one of the keys that we're going to be talking about is how. So when I first came to the dorm, you were already there,
Mm-hmm.
and any of the committees that you signed up for were strictly volunteer work. And I know that when I originally signed up to be a suicide companion, I didn't even know if I had the capabilities or the mental stability, because we face so many trials and tribulations within ourselves. But I didn't know if I was qualified to be a suicide companion, and I was reassured it's completely volunteer, so you can come off at any point in time. So can you talk about when you were first introduced to being a suicide companion and what that had looked like?
When I first joined the dorm, people could bring a book to suicide companions. You wrote what's called to from or a blue slip, just letting them know, or you would go up to one of the plus aides and they would get you trained. My original training was, if you talk to them, the officers usually didn't care. By the time I joined the suicide companions, they actually stopped allowing you to be able to take a book or a radio or anything else. But it wasn't a terrible 4 hours. It wasn't the greatest. 9 times out of 10, when somebody would get on suicide watch, they would sleep most of the time, whether that was they got their medications corrected, or given something to help them relax, or even if it was just as simple as they had gone through so much emotion to get on to that point in the first place, they just didn't have anything left in them.
Right.
Or if they were awake, you were able to talk to them and kind of see where they were. And we weren't therapists by any means, but sometimes just having somebody listen was an amazing thing. And it kind of showed us while we were in plus, or at least to me anyway, what could happen if we didn't take care of ourselves and take care of our mental side. My original training was the former chairperson. She literally just sat in one of the cubicles of the dorm room and she told us what the rules were, what we were and were not allowed to do. And yeah, that was basically very simple.
So can I ask, like, what were the pretenses that you signed up with that were kind of expected? Because one that we'll talk a little bit more about was that you were not to exceed a 4-hour shift in a 24-hour period. So what other promises or pretenses did you volunteer under?
You were supposed to go to lock or just outside of one of the lock areas. No messages backwards and forwards. By the time I joined, we weren't allowed to bring any materials with us. We were only allowed a cup of coffee and a pen. But we were still allowed to communicate with the person. Just weren't allowed to communicate with anybody else around us except for the occasional officer that would come by or the nurse. When we had to go to the bathroom, we just let the officer know. That was one of the other things that kind of got weird, is sometimes it was not the easiest to get the officer's attention. And then the pretense was if you didn't want to do it anymore, you would just write another message to whoever was in charge. There was usually a 30-day waiting period. I had been told by a friend of mine who had joined before I got there, and had just gotten taken off rotation, do not do it. Kind of like it's a trap thing. I did it. I didn't mind it. The more of us that joined, the less work it was on everybody else. And overall, it was kind of a community environment. You know, you could kind of decompress with other people who were on suicide companions as well.
Absolutely.
So,
Do you, and I'm really going to tap into your memory here, but do you know about how many suicide companions there were volunteering around the time that you had signed up, and
yeah, there was
until when you were chair? Well, not at the end of your chair position. We'll get there, but
oh, I remember exactly how many were there then.
Yeah, yeah.
When I first signed up, there was, I want to say, about 18 of us. It got up to as many as 24. There was only 69 people who were available to be suicide companions because that's how many people lived on the unit. And that was before they started letting outside volunteers and stuff like that. Outside volunteers as in people who didn't live on the unit. And apparently a couple of years before that, it had actually started off as a paid position where the prison would actually hire somebody and that was their job, was to be on call 24 hours a day. And they knew that they would have a set number of people and everything else who would do that job, just like any other prison job. Yep.
Yeah.
It was an actual paid position. And then they took that away. That way they could make it for Plus companions as a way of earning community service hours.
It shifted, right? Like it went from being volunteer to threatened, being written up on a CAB. And we'll talk about, you know, how extreme it really had gotten. But I just want to highlight the fact that when we signed up, we were actually participants of the Plus program. And if those that are watching had seen the previous shows that we had done, we had talked about what a classification was, and every person in the institution has a classification. It could be medical idle, but most people have a job that they have to report to. They have to report to either job or an education or the Plus program. So when you're in the Plus program, that's what it consists of. So is doing the classes in Plus, and then of course volunteering your time. So Lori, correct me if I'm wrong, but were you not still the chairperson of the committee upon graduation?
Yes. I had been called into the counselor's office for unrelated stuff, and she told me that the person who was the chairperson currently, which this is well after the elections, it was about halfway mark, or she had just taken over and was getting ready to be released. I don't remember the exact circumstances, but they wanted somebody who could take over it. We had tried different models of it. Some of it was based around when people would have classes, because Plus originally was supposed to be somebody's priority. And if you missed a certain number of classes, even if it was for an excused reason, you had to retake the class.
Correct.
That kind of got thrown out the window. I got called into her office and I don't want to say threatened, but it was implied that I would have to either retake some classes or my time in Plus would be extended, or potentially get moved off the unit and have to come back and then hope that the rotation of classes was the same if I didn't put my name on the list. Well, that was when we came up for elections, but if I did not decide to continue on with Plus, or continue on with being the chairperson of the Suicide Companions.
But you were threatened your entire program if you did not continue to be the chairperson of the committee. Now, I'm sorry, I had to pause because we're speaking like people that completely understand, but there's some people that don't understand exactly what Plus entails and what a chairperson looks like. So if you're chairperson of a committee, then you are responsible for the scheduling and meeting the expectations of whatever the demand is. So like there was an MMA pushers, there's Plus providers, there's suicide companion maintenance. So if an individual didn't go, then the responsibility fell on the chairperson to fulfill that spot. And so with an individual going in a rotation of 18 people, then you would you would go do a 4-hour shift in a 3-day period.
Yes. Not including meals, meal relief, if there wasn't somebody who was volunteered for that or anything else.
Right. So let's kind of fast forward just a little bit to when it got very demanding, very exhausting,
A little crazy,
very traumatic. Because it was very traumatic for me. That was the reason that I was requesting to come off and was threatened to be written up on a conduct report if I didn't report. But so explain some of the cases that you had seen while you were a suicide companion.
I think I saw a girl eat her own poop. I saw a girl bang her head until she was bleeding and almost not passed out, knocking, and to the point where, I don't know if you know this or if our viewers know it, when somebody hits their head in this particular spot over and over again, they actually build a calcium buildup. Mm-hmm. And you could see where she had done this many, many times in the past. They will not allow anybody who's incarcerated to get any type of helmet or anything else, no matter what the medical reason is, because it's considered a form of restraint, and restraints like that are not permissible in the state of Indiana anymore. Ironically, except strapping somebody to bed, which is a whole separate thing that I'm probably misrepresenting. But probably the worst of them, though, was I saw a girl who had just gotten back from taking a shower. Somebody had hid a razor blade inside the shower for her. She had stuck it up inside of her because she has to open her coat up and everything else and show that she didn't have it inside of her, or on her, I should say. She went back into her room and faced the wall, and I could see her shoulders moving. And that's when I started yelling at her and yelling at the officer. And by the time the officer got out the secure door and everything else and got over to her, there was just so much blood. To this day, I never really was a huge fan of horror movies to begin with, but if it's too gory, I can't do it anymore. Saw people pull stitches out of their arms after being goaded by a senior officer, who actually, that person was a friend of mine before. So kind of like a double trauma. And then when I did get a chance to speak to her, once she got out of, lock and suicide and everything else, I had to explain to her why it was hard for me to see her and to hang out with her and just to be a normal friend.
Yeah.
Because I understand that the mental illness isn't her, and the person that I loved and cared about, who was such a good friend of mine, who took good care of me and everything else. I had to explain to her that it hurt me to be around her.
So I want to kind of slow down a little bit, because you're saying all of these things that you had witnessed, but we're not talking about a horror movie, right? We're talking about real life. This is somebody that you can't get to because they're behind a door. You can't stop them.
Locked door.
Right. And you can't stop them, but you also are not allowed to take eyes off of them. You're required to watch this. You are begging and pleading for officers to come and address the situation, and you're on their timeline. You're on their time frame. And I don't want to discredit all of the officers, because
some of them
we did have
amazing.
Phenomenal officers.
Yes.
That were back there, and they truly cared about the individual. But we also had some that weren't. And to watch somebody cut themselves with a razor, to watch somebody bang their head up against the wall and just to sit back and watch hopelessly, that does something to an individual. So there's a shift there, right? A shift takes place, and you're forced at this point, you're forced to assist somebody else with their mental health, all the while you're compromising your own mental health. And that's why this conversation is so serious on both ends, right? Because it's just as damaging for the individual that's being held in segregation for extended periods of time because they have mental health issues, but also on the flip side, the forced companions that are having to watch this.
You know, when it got later on, which I know we'll get to this here in a little bit, I had put in slips to see the therapist there, and I was considered lower priority because I was a general population person. Basically, they already had enough people who were in therapy that they couldn't get other people involved in the rotation. And I started going to every lunch, dinner, breakfast, and everything else. And I was telling every single officer who would even look me in the eye, because that was enough. That was enough go ahead, that I would talk to them and I would sit there and beg them, you have to give us something. And I was saying we, but I really meant me.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew I wasn't the only person who needed that.
Right.
And then there were a lot of other people who I think were scared to go to suicide companion therapy afterwards, because they did eventually get it to where we would be able to see a therapist. They would make sure that there was somebody on staff, that we would get higher priority. But a lot of them were scared to go, and I think they were scared of letting down the group and the team and everything else.
Can I ask what your experience was with that? Because I too had gone, and the recommendation for me when I went was that they put me on medication, but keep me on as a suicide companion, which of course, I denied, just because of the environment. You have no control about what you're being put on. You have no idea when you're going to see the doctor again. If it's not working out well, you're not supposed to just come off of these medications on your own. Furthermore,
you can get written up if you don't.
Why is it that I am getting put on medication for somebody else's mental health issues? Actually, right? The forms of discipline that they used when they witnessed an individual doing these things. How did you see staff handle an individual that was self-harming?
Some of them were with such compassion, would, I don't want to say talking down, because it makes it sound like it wasn't that serious. And if I would have just talked to them, it would have been better. But a lot of these officers had known these people since, well, some of them had been girls' school counselors and everything ahead of time. So they've literally known these people since they were children. They've been around this for so long. Some of them just had so much love and compassion, and if there weren't cameras everywhere, they would have just hugged them and tried to make everything better. And then I saw others where
there's definitely a shift, right? There's definitely a shift.
Where the nurses, the person banged their head and they probably have a concussion and they're not even willing to give them any pain medicine. And I mean pain medicine isn't an ibuprofen or anything else. And just telling them, well, if you wouldn't have done this, you wouldn't be hurting. Mm-hmm. And they know that. They're not stupid. Yes, they're mentally ill, but they're not stupid by any means. And if they felt like they had any other option, they would have done it.
Well, and I think that it's also important to point out the fact that they would take, okay, so they call the green suits like turtle suits. Mm-hmm. Somebody that's on suicide watch has nothing but the mattress and that turtle suit. But I saw forms of punishment where the mattress was taken. Yeah. I've seen where the turtle suit was even taken. But also I've seen more extremes where mace was used when they couldn't get them to comply with what they were asking.
There was every other form of punishment. There was even, I saw one where a girl had finally stopped hurting herself. She was calm. She was, had just woken up, was asking me questions, and I was trying to tell her, I can't talk to you right now. And the person saw them talking to me, okay, not even me saying anything to them. But I had shook my head no, and I was threatened to get rode up, and the person was so defensive of me that that's when she pulled her own stitches out, just because she knew that it was wrong what had just happened, and she was scared that I was going to get rode up when I was just trying to literally be there and I already couldn't do anything, couldn't communicate. And they started to consider, you know, and I know I'm not the only person that this had happened to, where they would threaten to write up the companions as a way of getting back at the person on suicide watch.
Right.
You
I
know,
think it's important to note that during our time there, now there was a shift in administration before we had gotten there. But then we had also witnessed a shift in administration as well. And so the more sensitive, understanding, and compassionate officers, I guess it's probably between like 2012 and 2015 that we had all of those officers retire because
they
of
either
the way that they were.
retired or they got demoted and got scared or they
Yeah,
got fired. We witnessed people who were literally months away from retirement get fired for the dumbest reasons.
yeah.
Um,
So
yeah.
so it was in that shift, right? Like in between that
Mm-hmm. Well, and
the approach to handle
the shift caused the officers who were companion or compassionate to kind of be targeted from higher ups.
exactly. And that's why a lot of them ended up retiring, is because of the way that they were the different rules that they were implementing and enforcing. And a lot of it had to do with the way that they were demanding that the women be treated, because incarcerated individuals are nothing but manipulative and conniving and backbiting, and they're
Drug
just trying to,
and
you know.
everything
Anyways,
else.
so the treatment towards the suicide companions also shifted when the staff began to shift. And so what I had witnessed is a lot of younger officers were coming in, and a lot of them, I think the training was different as well. And so a lot of them came in very cold to us. We didn't even we didn't have to give them a reason to be upset. They came in upset. And so that's when I really had noticed that the approach of discipline was with spraying them with the OC. And were you there when anybody got sprayed? Or you just heard
There were two, it was a time when we had double suicide companions, and one of the other people, not the person I was watching, but another person got sprayed. There was a time, but they made me leave lock, and then they sprayed her and put her on restraint, so I was sent back to the unit. But it was never directly in front of me, if that
Oh,
makes sense.
okay. So
Um,
I had experienced the actual person that I was sitting on being sprayed. And so in the doors on lock, they have these little, what do they call them? Little bean.
I call it a pie hole, which I know is wrong.
But they're just these little trays fit in them when they're giving them lunch and whatnot. And so I was told to get up and step aside, and they moved my chair that I was sitting in and just sprayed right there. And it was, the effects of it that I had. I mean, it was horrible.
Well, and that goes through the recycled air, so it gets into all the other women who are there. I mean, I was on a unit that got sprayed, and me being the first door, even though it was all the way in the day room, I was still choking and coughing and everything else. And that wasn't even inside my own room or even within 20, 30 feet of my room.
Right. Right. And also, I think that I want to acknowledge the fact that when you go and you sit with somebody as a suicide companion, you go in and the first thing that you do is you go into the bathroom and you have to do a strip search.
See, that was something that totally changed from when we first started too. It went from we would get patted down when we got in and out. If you were inside lock, if you weren't inside lock, you didn't get patted down. Then it was as soon as you arrived for your shift, you would get patted down no matter where you were. And then it transferred into you were supposed to lift up your shirt and bra and everything and take down your pants and underwear, all the way to you had to strip completely bare as if you were leaving with outside clearance to get off site.
Right.
So that alone was a huge shift. And that was something that being forced to strip down kind of puts you in the mindset of trauma, especially for anybody who's experienced any type of sexual abuse or anything else, or just overall manipulation. Because once again, this is a voluntary thing, and we were volunteered to force to strip. It was weird.
So what ended up leading, what ultimately led to you quitting as a suicide companion? And I just want to reiterate, when I had reached out to you, you said, what do you want to know? Why I quit on you guys? And my response was that you didn't quit on us, Laura. You quit on the facility. And I think that a lot of people actually admired the stance that you had taken. But go ahead, share your story.
Several months before I eventually quit and got fired at the same time, it was a mutual thing that wasn't very mutual. We had people getting fired left and right. Some of them had joined Suicide Companion for the wrong reason. They knew somebody who was a block. They wanted to communicate with them. And I say for the wrong reason. This is literally benign conversations across a room. There were some people who would try to traffic a note or something like that, but that was so far in the minority. That was such a thing that they would threaten us with, but that was not something that happened very often at all. There were just all kinds of things. But I had tried to quit. I once again got called into my counselor's office and was told that I would not be allowed to live on the unit anymore. So at one point, this is when I got replaced as Suicide Companion chairperson. I had been saying over and over again, I didn't want to be the chairperson. By this point, I'd given up being removed from the list of being a companion, so I was okay with that. But when I kept getting ignored, I stood outside my counselor's office and yelled, I quit, over and over again. I got moved that night to another unit for 90 days. Still was on the Suicide Companions. I was actually one of the first 3 people who was ever allowed to be a Suicide Companion who did not live on the unit. And I was the only person who had not sent a message saying that I wanted to still be a Suicide Companion. I think the move and still being a companion was part of my punishment. And I was not allowed to, sometimes with companions, they would be allowed to switch shifts based on what their needs were, education, classes, whatever the case was. I was not allowed to do that at all.
Well, because you're right, because I think that that's important to state too, is that if you had a shift to fulfill, that didn't take place of your other classification. So if you were a graduate and you had moved on to either another job or education, you were still required to be in your classes. If you signed up for any kind of workout or anything, group or anything along those lines, at the beginning of the trimester, then you were placed on a count letter. And again, you had to go to that. So if you worked from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m., then you go from school from 7 or work from 7 to 3:30 or 3. And then you have a count letter at 3:30 to 5, and then maybe another one again. I mean, you're just out of luck, right? And the only time
you could do that the next day or the day after. You didn't need to.
Right, exactly. And the only time you were exempt from going to what you were on the count letter for was if you were going to be a suicide companion.
Yeah. And in the beginning, there were still people who were written up for not showing up, and they had to get our counselor to prove that they were actually at suicide watch. Nobody ever actually got in trouble for that, but it was still, that's a scary thing when you get wrote up. You're potentially losing time. Say somebody had already had a CAB in the past, they were potentially getting threatened with block, losing classification, losing time, everything, for doing something that was voluntary and that they weren't able to get out of 9 times out of 10.
And how many suicide companions were there on the list at the time that you had quit?
Um, 4 or 5. And so that literally left us less than 24 hours on a rotation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there was at one point, I literally cried. Um, they had called a double suicide companion, and it turned out it was wrong. And I was not the only person who was crying at that time, because we were exhausted. It
And
was
how long was the, so how long were you sitting on the one individual prior to the second one being called? So you're going about,
probably a month or two, or not a month or two, probably a week or two. But we might get 2 or 3 days of not having anyone on Suicide Companion before somebody else would end up on it again. So this was something that, like you said, in addition to our classes and our groups and, everything else, we had a 4-hour chunk of every single day that was taken up with Suicide Companion. And a lot of times, we had drank coffee while we were there just to stay awake. And then we got back, and whether it was a boring shift, which means nothing happened, or an eventful shift, you can't just fall asleep after that.
mm-hmm.
One thing I did notice was people shifting to trying to help themselves fall asleep. A lot of that involved using allergy medicine, which kind of scared me as a person who drug addiction was not what my main problem was whenever I was arrested, and wasn't considered a serious problem to DOC's classifications of stuff. But I knew that that was something that could be a slippery slope. But it was such a hard thing. Do I want to make sure I don't look like I'm sleeping during my shift and get rode up, or, hope I can sleep later?
Well, I remember that I ended up leaving the facility when I stopped being a suicide companion. But there's one girl that we were sitting on, and she used to bite holes in her arm and try to pull, whether it was fat or I don't know what it was on the inside of her arm. I assume it was fat, and throw it at the window. There's one girl that we would sit on her, and then we'd come off for a day, sometimes an hour, 2 days or so, and then we'd be right back on again. And there was another girl that was a safe keep there, that she was having issues at the county, and the county couldn't take care of it, so they sent her to us, and we had to sit on her 24/7 for 10 months. And we had at one point 3 suicide companions.
People
it,
on suicide watch.
and
And
it,
even if you would have had the
it's hard
original
to make me
number of
so mad.
18.
They at one point, towards the end, they made it to where you couldn't even take coffee.
Yeah, because they were afraid that you guys were slipping notes in. And I say you guys because by that point I'd been removed from the list. Oh, yeah, going back to that lovely story before I forget, because that was kind of a very dramatic end. I still think one of the funniest things before I get to that point, though, was one day with somebody who was considered a volatile person. So they were only allowed to take her out of her room or even open the door. She had to be handcuffed ahead of time. Before she was handcuffed, she had to put a mask over her face
Mm-hmm.
that was a spit mask, so she couldn't spit at the officers. And they had to have a can of mace aimed at her face the entire time.
Yeah.
I dropped my pen and it rolled under the door, and I couldn't get it back out. And she was asleep. But I think the most hilarious thing that ever happened was the officers having to go to their higher ups and figure out, were they allowed to open the door, and hope that she did not awaken during this time period.
Okay.
Yeah, no. So I had to write in there that they had to do an incident report because of a pen.
Oh my gosh.
And that had to be charted, and because the suicide companions have to make notes every 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just after that, like I said, I'd been trying to get off the suicide companions. I'd been trying to get access to mental health. We had just been told right before then that we would be given priority, not even a week or two before that, and it wasn't happening. And it could just be me being, when you get in that panic mode, nothing seems like it's moving fast enough, except everything that you don't want to move at all.
Right.
And I had put in a mental health slip and I still hadn't seen the person. And it hadn't been a week yet, but it still felt like it had been forever. So at one point, keep in mind, I had just lost my brother at this point, and I think this was just after I lost my stepdad on the anniversary of my daughter passing away.
Hmm.
And all of this was within 1 year. I actually got so mad at one point while I was on Suicide Companions. I stood up while I was on shift. I said, I quit. This is bullshit. I think I said a few other profanities. At the time, we had some of the sweetest officers working, the ones who really did care. And the girl was hurting herself and eating her own feces and everything else. And I was told that the only thing that I really needed to chart was her hurting herself. And really, we were kind of told not to go into detail about how they were hurting themselves or how long the duration was or anything else. We were basically told to keep it to a minimum. And by this point, they'd put so many restrictions on us and everything else. I literally stood up, I threw my pen across Locke's ground, and I said, I quit. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. And then I walked to the part leading to the laundry room, which is where we do our dress out, which is stripped down to our, well, not even underwear. And I sagged against the wall and cried in a little ball for quite some time. And like I said I quit. This is how I say I quit and got fired on the same day. The officer called it in. She actually made multiple phone calls. I found out later on she called all the way up to, I want to say, the major or the captain in command at that time, and got me immediately removed from the list.
So you were able to escape without a CAB, a conduct report.
I think they were scared of anything that might happen after that, just because obviously I'd had a breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
The officers on duty, and I also had a really awesome boss at the time who had been with the facility for a long time, and I had spoken with her about it, about trying to get off companions. And so there was enough paper evidence that I had been trying to get off,
Right.
that I think they were scared of any repercussions of not letting me off.
No, it's you saying that just made me remember, because going back to the pretenses on which we volunteered for was that all we had to do was send a to and from to get on the list to get trained, and all we had to do if we wanted to come off is send a to and from. And I remember that we would send them over and over and over again, and they would not send them back to us. We wouldn't get them back, because then we would have evidence that we've been trying to do that and never got one returned.
We had one or two people that I found out why some people were getting off and other people weren't, but it wasn't until before I was released. We had people who were asking to go to the law library so that they could make a copy of their to from before they sent it, just so they would have their own copy. One person's got lost in the shakedown, which was just so amazing. Like, at that point, it was not even trying to cover up, but it was considered contraband because that's not a legal form. And they had made the copy at the law library, which that then made it contraband.
Yeah. You know, it absolutely amazes me the lengths that the facility would go to. You know, and one of my biggest issues with it is the fact that I wasn't aware that it was a classification prior to me arriving at the facility, but I was aware that it is a classification at the men's facility, and that they have about 80 men on a dorm that are all suicide companions. And just the extreme difference in the way that it was held at or handled at the Indiana Women's Prison, and the fact that you know, that goes into that trauma that you experienced there, that nobody's even aware of.